The morning sun painted the Colorado Territory in shades of gold and amber as Thomas Mitchell guided his weathered wagon along the dusty trail. His horses snorted and stamped, eager for water after the long journey from Denver. Thomas had been traveling for 3 days, carrying supplies to the remote trading post at Bear Creek. The year was 1876, and tensions between settlers and Native American tribes ran high across the western frontier. Thomas was not like most men who ventured into these dangerous lands. Standing tall with kind eyes and calloused hands, he had spent years working as a blacksmith before deciding to try his luck as a trader. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Thomas held no hatred toward the indigenous peoples. His father had taught him that all men deserved respect, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. As his wagon creaked along the narrow path beside the rushing river, Thomas noticed storm clouds gathering overhead. The peaceful morning was about to turn violent. Thunder rumbled in the distance and the wind picked up, sending dust swirling around the wagon wheels. Thomas pulled his hat down tight and urged his horses forward, hoping to reach shelter before the storm hit. The river beside the trail had been running high all week due to spring snowmelt from the mountains. The water moved fast and dangerous, carrying fallen trees and debris downstream. Thomas had crossed this same path many times, but today something felt different. The air seemed charged with electricity, and his horses grew increasingly nervous. The first raindrops began to fall. Thomas heard something that made his blood run cold. Above the sound of thunder and rushing water came the unmistakable cries of children in distress. He pulled his wagon to a halt and listened carefully. There it was again. High-pitched screams carried on the wind. Without hesitation, Thomas jumped down from his wagon and ran toward the sound. Through the increasing rain, he could see the swollen river had overflowed its banks in several places. Fallen logs and rocks created dangerous rapids that would challenge even the strongest swimmer. As he got closer to the water's edge, Thomas spotted them. 2 small figures thrashed desperately in the churning water about 50 yards downstream. They appeared to be children, no more than 8 or 9 years old, fighting against the powerful current that threatened to drag them under. Their dark hair and clothing told Thomas they were Native American children, probably from one of the local tribes. The children had likely been playing near the riverbank when the sudden storm surge caught them off guard. Now they were trapped, in the middle of the raging torrent, too far from shore to swim to safety. Every second that passed carried them further downstream toward even more dangerous rapids. Thomas didn't stop to think about the risks or consider that these children belonged to a people many settlers considered enemies. All he saw were 2 young lives in mortal danger. He quickly scanned the riverbank for anything that might help with a rescue. A fallen tree stretched partway into the water, but it wouldn't reach far enough. The rain was coming down harder now, making the already treacherous river even more violent. Thomas realized he had only minutes before the children would either drown or be swept into the deadly rapids below. He began pulling off his heavy boots and coat, preparing to enter the freezing water himself. As he waded into the river, the current immediately tried to knock him off his feet. The water was shockingly cold, fed by mountain snow that had melted only days before. Thomas gritted his teeth and pushed deeper, fighting against the force that wanted to carry him downstream alongside the children. The first child, a young boy, was weakening fast. His desperate attempts to stay afloat were becoming less coordinated as exhaustion and cold water sapped his strength. Thomas knew he had to reach him first as the boy appeared to be in the most immediate danger. Using every ounce of strength he possessed, Thomas battled through the current until he could grab the boy's outstretched hand. The child's grip was weak, but Thomas held on tight and began the difficult process of fighting back toward shore. The current seemed determined to claim them both, pulling with relentless force. Step by step, Thomas dragged himself and the boy through the churning water. His muscles screamed with effort, and the cold made his movements clumsy and slow. Behind him he could hear the second child, a young girl still crying out as she was carried further downstream. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Thomas managed to reach the muddy riverbank with the boy. He pulled the unconscious child onto dry ground and quickly checked for signs of life. The boy was breathing but barely conscious, his lips blue from cold and his body shaking violently. Thomas couldn't rest. The second child was still in the water, now even further downstream and growing weaker by the minute. Without pausing to catch his breath, he plunged back into the river. This rescue would be even more difficult, as the girl had been carried toward a section where the water moved faster and deeper. The storm continued to rage overhead as Thomas fought his way through the treacherous current once again. Lightning flashed across the dark sky, briefly illuminating the desperate scene playing out in the river. The girl's cries were growing fainter, and Thomas knew he was running out of time. When he finally reached her, the girl was barely conscious. Her small hands could barely maintain their grip as Thomas wrapped his arm around her waist. The return journey to shore pushed Thomas to his absolute limits. His legs felt like lead, and his lungs burned from the effort of fighting the current while keeping both himself and the child above water. Somehow, through sheer determination and perhaps divine intervention, Thomas managed to reach the riverbank. With the second child, he collapsed onto the muddy ground beside both children, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The rain continued to pour down, but the immediate danger had passed. Both children were alive but in serious condition. They needed warmth and shelter immediately, or they might still die from exposure to the cold. Thomas gathered the unconscious children in his arms and carried them to his wagon, where he wrapped them in every blanket and dry cloth he could find. As he worked to warm the children and restore their breathing, Thomas had no idea that he was being watched. Hidden among the trees on the opposite side of the river, several pairs of eyes had witnessed the entire rescue. Word of what the white stranger had done would soon spread through the tribal camp, setting in motion events that would change Thomas Mitchell's life forever. The storm began to subside as Thomas continued caring for the two children, unaware that by morning, their grateful father would arrive with 100 mounted warriors behind him. Thomas spent the entire night fighting to keep the two children alive. Inside his cramped wagon, he had created a makeshift shelter from the storm using canvas tarps and wooden crates. The children lay wrapped in every blanket he owned, their small bodies still shivering from their ordeal in the icy river. The boy, who appeared to be the older of the two, had regained consciousness first. His dark eyes watched Thomas with a mixture of fear and confusion as the stranger tended to his wounds. The child spoke no English and Thomas knew no words in the local tribal language, but somehow they managed to communicate through gestures and gentle touches. Thomas had learned basic medical care during his time as a blacksmith, treating workers who suffered burns and cuts in the forge. Now he applied that knowledge to caring for the children. He checked their breathing regularly, massaged their cold limbs to restore circulation, and forced warm water between their lips whenever they were conscious enough to swallow. The girl was in worse condition. She had swallowed more river water and remained unconscious for longer periods. Thomas feared she might have suffered internal injuries from being battered against rocks in the current. He stayed awake all night, monitoring her breathing and keeping her warm with heated stones wrapped in cloth. Outside the wagon, the storm continued to rage. Wind howled through the trees and rain pounded against the canvas covering. Thomas periodically peered out into the darkness, wondering if anyone was searching for the missing children. Surely their family had noticed they were gone by now and would be looking for them. What Thomas didn't know was that the children's disappearance had indeed been discovered. Their names were Little Hawk and Morning Star, and they were the son and daughter of Chief Running Bear, one of the most respected leaders of the Cheyenne Nation in the region. When the children failed to return from their afternoon play by the river, search parties had immediately been organized. The tribal warriors had been scouring the riverbank for hours when the storm hit, forcing them to seek shelter and wait for daylight. Running Bear himself led one of the search groups, his heart heavy with fear for his missing children. The chief was known for his fierce protection of his people and his deep love for his family. As dawn approached, Thomas noticed the girl's breathing had become more regular and some color had returned to her cheeks. The boy was sitting up on his own, though he remained weak and disoriented. Thomas offered them small pieces of dried meat and hardtack from his supplies, encouraging them to eat to regain their strength. Through the early morning hours, Thomas had tried to communicate with the children about where they belonged, The boy pointed repeatedly toward the mountains to the west in the direction of the tribal territories. Thomas understood they needed to be returned to their people, but he also knew that approaching a Native American camp as a lone white man could be extremely dangerous. The relationship between settlers and tribes in this region had been strained for years. Recent conflicts over land rights and broken treaties had created an atmosphere of mutual distrust and hostility. Many tribal leaders viewed all white men as enemies, while settlers often feared and misunderstood Native American customs and intentions. Thomas faced a difficult decision. He could try to find the nearest military outpost or settlement and report what had happened, letting others handle the return of the children. This would be the safest option for him personally. Alternatively, he could attempt to locate the children's tribe himself and return them directly to their families. The more Thomas thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't abandon the children now. They had trusted him during their darkest hour, and he felt responsible for seeing them safely home. Besides, he reasoned, surely any parent would be grateful to have their children returned alive, regardless of who had saved them. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Thomas made his decision. He would follow the direction the boy had indicated and look for signs of the tribal camp. The children were strong enough to travel, and every hour that passed meant their families suffered more worry and grief. Thomas carefully loaded his supplies back into the wagon, making sure the children were comfortable among the soft blankets and sacks of grain. He gave them more water and food, and tried to explain through gestures that he was taking them home. The boy seemed to understand and nodded eagerly, while the girl managed a weak smile. The journey began slowly as Thomas guided his wagon along unfamiliar trails leading toward the mountains. The children took turns pointing out landmarks and directing him along paths that would have been invisible to his untrained eyes. Despite the language barrier, they worked together as a team, united by their common goal. After several hours of travel, Thomas began to notice signs that they were entering tribal territory. Horse tracks in the mud became more frequent, and he spotted smoke from distant fires. The children grew more animated, chattering to each other in their native language and pointing excitedly at familiar surroundings. Thomas felt his own nervousness increasing as they traveled deeper into Cheyenne lands. He was now completely dependent on the goodwill of people who had every reason to view him as a threat. His only protection was the presence of the two children and the hope that their rescue would speak louder than the color of his skin. What Thomas couldn't see was that his approach had already been detected by tribal scouts. Riders had been dispatched to inform Chief Running Bear that a white man in a wagon was approaching the camp with 2 small passengers. The chief's heart leaped with hope when he heard the description of the children, but he was also suspicious of the stranger's motives. Running Bear quickly assembled a war party of his most trusted warriors. If this white man had harmed his children or was attempting some kind of deception, there would be swift justice. But if the stranger had truly saved Little Hawk and Morning Star, the chief would need to respond appropriately to such an act of courage and compassion. As Thomas's wagon crested a small hill, he saw them in the distance, a long line of mounted warriors spread across the valley below. Even from far away, he could see they were armed and ready for battle. His heart began to pound as he realized he was about to face the most dangerous moment of his life. The children saw the warriors too, and began calling out in their native language. Thomas couldn't understand their words, but their excited voices suggested they recognized familiar faces among the approaching riders. As the war party drew closer, Thomas could see they were led by a tall, powerfully built man wearing the feathers and paint of a chief. Thomas brought his wagon to a halt and waited. There was nowhere to run, and no point in trying to escape. His fate now lay in the hands of Chief Running Bear and the 100 warriors who surrounded him. All he could do was hope that his actions in saving the children would be enough to protect him from the vengeance that might await any white man found alone in Cheyenne territory. The thunder of 100 horses' hooves shook the ground as Chief Running Bear and his warriors approached Thomas's wagon. Dust clouds swirled in the morning air, and the jingling of weapons and horse gear created an ominous soundtrack to what might be Thomas's final moments. The white trader sat perfectly still on his wagon seat, his hands visible and empty, showing no sign of aggression or intention to flee. Chief Running Bear rode at the front of the war party, his face a mask of controlled emotion. The chief was a man in his 40s, tall and lean, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, and war paint marked his cheeks in the traditional patterns of his rank. His dark eyes missed nothing as they studied the white stranger who claimed to have saved his children. Behind the chief rode his most trusted warriors, men who had fought beside him in countless battles against enemy tribes and encroaching settlers. Each warrior carried weapons, bows, lances, and some of the newer rifles acquired through trade. Their faces showed the hard expressions of men prepared for violence if their leader commanded it. As the war party formed a wide circle around Thomas's wagon, the children inside began calling out excitedly. "Father! Father!" Little Hawk cried in Cheyenne, while his sister Morning Star tried to stand up despite her weakness. Their voices carried clearly across the tense silence that had fallen over the scene. Chief Running Bear's stern expression flickered for just a moment when he heard his children's voices. Relief and joy threatened to break through his carefully maintained composure, but years of leadership had taught him caution. Many white men had proven themselves capable of great deception, using kindness as a mask for treachery. The chief raised his hand and the circle of warriors came to a halt. Their horses snorted and stamped, sensing the tension in the air. Some of the younger warriors fingered their weapons, eager to avenge the many wrongs their people had suffered at the hands of white settlers. Only their absolute loyalty to Running Bear kept them from acting on their anger. "White man," the chief spoke in heavily accented English, his voice carrying the authority of generations of leaders. "You travel in our lands with our children. Explain yourself before my warriors decide your fate." Thomas slowly stood up in his wagon, careful to keep his movements non-threatening. He could feel dozens of hostile eyes watching his every gesture, ready to react to any sign of danger. The morning sun cast long shadows across the scene, highlighting the dramatic confrontation between two very different worlds. "Great Chief," Thomas began, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Yesterday I found these children drowning in the big river during the storm. I pulled them from the water and cared for them through the night. Now I bring them home to you, their family." Little Hawk suddenly spoke up in rapid Cheyenne, gesturing animatedly toward Thomas. The boy's words caused a murmur to run through the assembled warriors. Morning Star, though still weak, added her own voice to her brother's account. Both children seemed to be defending the white stranger with passionate intensity. Chief Running Bear listened carefully to his children's words, his expression gradually softening as they described their ordeal and rescue. The other warriors also seemed affected by the children's testimony. Several nodded approvingly while others exchanged meaningful looks with their neighbors. One of the senior warriors, an elderly man with gray braids and numerous battle scars, rode closer to his chief. "Running Bear," he said in Cheyenne, "your children speak truth. See how they defend this white man. See how they are alive and unharmed. This one is different from the others." The chief studied Thomas more carefully now, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. What he saw was a man who appeared genuinely concerned for the children's welfare. Thomas's clothes were still damp from his time in the river, and his hands bore fresh scratches from fighting through the current and debris. "Show me," Running Bear commanded, dismounting from his horse with fluid grace. Several warriors immediately followed suit, forming a protective semicircle around their leader. The chief approached the wagon slowly, his hand resting casually on the handle of his knife. Thomas carefully helped both children down from the wagon, supporting Morning Star, who was still unsteady on her feet. As soon as they were on the ground, both children ran to their father, who swept them into his powerful arms. For a moment, the fierce war chief disappeared, replaced by a father overwhelmed with gratitude and relief. The warriors watched their leader's emotional reunion with his children, and many of them felt their own hostility toward the white stranger beginning to diminish. It was clear that Little Hawk and Morning Star had been well cared for, and their obvious affection for Thomas spoke volumes about his character. After holding his children close for several long minutes, Chief Running Bear stood and faced Thomas directly, The two men looked at each other across the vast cultural divide that separated their peoples. One was a Native American leader fighting to protect his way of life. The other, a white settler trying to make an honest living in a dangerous land. "You saved my children's lives," the chief said simply, his English careful but clear. "This is a debt that cannot be easily repaid. Among my people, such an act creates bonds that last beyond this lifetime." Thomas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but he remained cautious. He had heard too many stories of situations like this turning violent without warning. "I ask for no payment, Chief Running Bear. I only did what any decent man would do when he saw children in danger." The chief's eyes narrowed slightly at this response. In his experience, white men always wanted something in return for their actions. Land, gold, trading rights, safe passage. There was always a price. The fact that this stranger claimed to want nothing made him either exceptionally noble or exceptionally cunning. Little Hawk tugged at his father's arm and spoke earnestly in Cheyenne. The boy was describing how Thomas had risked his own life in the raging river, how he had cared for them through the cold night, and how he had brought them home despite the obvious danger to himself. Running Bear listened to his son's account, then looked back at Thomas with new understanding. This white man had indeed risked everything to save two Native American children, expecting no reward and facing possible death at the hands of their people. Such courage and compassion deserved recognition. The chief turned to address his assembled warriors in Cheyenne, his voice carrying across the circle of mounted men. He spoke of honor and debt, of courage that transcended the boundaries between peoples. He reminded them of the old ways, when brave acts were rewarded regardless of which tribe performed them. When he finished speaking, a remarkable transformation occurred among the warriors. Weapons were lowered, and hostile expressions softened into looks of respect and even admiration. Several of the men nodded approvingly, while others made gestures of acknowledgement toward Thomas. "Thomas Mitchell," the chief said, having somehow learned the trader's name during the children's account. "You have shown great courage and kindness to my family. By the laws of my people, you are now under our protection. No harm will come to you while you travel in our territory." But Chief Running Bear was not finished. The debt he felt toward this white stranger went deeper than mere protection. In saving Little Hawk and Morning Star, Thomas had preserved the future of the chief's bloodline and the continuation of his family's honor. Such a debt demanded a response that would be remembered for generations. The chief raised his voice so all his warriors could hear his next words clearly. What he said next would shock Thomas and create a legend that would be told around campfires for decades to come. Chief Running Bear raised his lance high above his head, the morning sun glinting off its metal point. The gesture commanded absolute silence from his warriors, and even the horses seemed to sense the importance of what was about to happen. Thomas stood beside his wagon, uncertain of what this dramatic moment might bring. "Warriors of the Cheyenne Nation," the chief called out in his native language, his voice carrying the weight of ancient tradition. "This white man has given my children the gift of life itself. He has shown courage that would make our greatest warriors proud. By our most sacred laws, such a debt can only be repaid with the highest honor we can bestow." The assembled warriors murmured among themselves, understanding immediately what their chief intended. Several of the older men nodded approvingly, recognizing the wisdom and justice of Running Bear's decision. The younger warriors, still burning with anger toward white settlers in general, were slower to accept what was happening. Running Bear continued speaking, his words carrying across the circle of mounted men. "From this day forward, Thomas Mitchell shall be known as Brother Who Saves Children. He is adopted into our tribe with all the rights and protections that title brings. Any who harm him harm the Cheyenne Nation itself." The chief then turned to face Thomas directly, switching to English so the white man could understand. "Thomas Mitchell, you have proven yourself worthy of our highest respect. I name you blood brother to Chief Running Bear and honorary member of our tribe. You may travel anywhere in our territory with complete safety." Thomas was stunned by this unexpected honor. He had hoped to escape this encounter with his life intact, never imagining he might be welcomed into the very community that many of his fellow settlers considered their enemy. The magnitude of what was being offered slowly sank in as he looked at the faces of the warriors around him. But Chief Running Bear was not finished with his proclamation. The debt he felt toward Thomas went beyond personal gratitude. It touched the very heart of Cheyenne values about courage, sacrifice, and the protection of children. What happened next would become legend throughout the territory. "My brothers," the chief announced to his warriors. "Brother who saves children must be escorted safely to his destination, with all the honor befitting his brave deed. We shall ride with him as his guard until he reaches the place he calls home." Collective intake of breath came from the assembled warriors. What their chief was proposing was unprecedented. An escort of 100 Cheyenne warriors accompanying a white settler would be visible for miles across the open territory. Every military patrol, every settlement, and every trading post would see this extraordinary procession. Thomas felt his heart racing as he realized what this meant. While the chief's gesture was intended as the highest honor, it would also mark Thomas forever as someone who had special relationships with the Cheyenne. Some settlers would view this as treachery, while military authorities might consider him a security risk. Little Hawk and Morning Star stood close to their father, still weak from their ordeal but clearly excited by the dramatic events unfolding around them. They had unwittingly become the catalysts for something that could change relations between their people and the white settlers forever. "Great Chief," Thomas said carefully, "I am deeply honored by your offer, but such a large escort might cause misunderstandings with my people. They might see your warriors as a threat rather than an honor guard." Running Bear considered this wisdom. The white man was right. His people had little understanding of Cheyenne customs and would likely interpret a war party as hostile regardless of its actual intentions. But the chief also knew that allowing Thomas to travel unescorted would be seen by his own people as insufficient recognition of the debt they owed. After a moment of thought, Running Bear proposed a compromise that demonstrated his skill as both a warrior and a diplomat. "Then we shall ride with you only part of the way, until you are near the lands where white soldiers patrol. But let all who see us know that Brother Who Saves Children travels under the protection of Chief Running Bear." The war party began to reorganize itself around Thomas's wagon, transforming from a potential threat into an honor guard. Warriors who had arrived ready for battle now positioned themselves as protectors of the man who had saved their chief's children. Some rode ahead as scouts, others flanked the wagon, and still others followed behind in a formation that spoke of respect rather than aggression. As the remarkable procession began to move, Thomas found himself at the center of one of the most unusual sights ever witnessed in the Colorado Territory. His modest trader's wagon was surrounded by 100 mounted Cheyenne warriors in full regalia, their weapons now held in ceremonial positions rather than as threats. The elderly warrior who had spoken earlier rode alongside Thomas's wagon, serving as an unofficial interpreter and guide. His name was Gray Wolf, and he had been present at many historic negotiations between his people and various white authorities. He understood better than most how significant this moment truly was. "Brother Who Saves Children," Gray Wolf said in careful English using the new name the chief had bestowed, "you have done something remarkable today. Never in my long life have I seen a white man welcomed into our tribe in this way. Your courage has opened a door that has been closed for many seasons." Thomas listened carefully to the old warrior's words while trying to process the surreal nature of his situation. Just yesterday, he had been a simple trader carrying supplies to a remote outpost. Now he found himself adopted into a Cheyenne tribe and escorted by a war party that could intimidate an entire cavalry regiment. As they traveled, other warriors began to approach Thomas's wagon to express their respect and gratitude. Some offered gifts, beautifully crafted arrowheads, small pieces of carved bone, or strips of jerky made from buffalo meat. Each gesture was a sign of acceptance and friendship that transcended the language barrier between them. The procession moved slowly but steadily across the rolling plains, creating a dust cloud visible for miles in every direction. Thomas knew that anyone observing from a distance would be witnessing something that had never happened before, and might never happen again. The sight of Cheyenne warriors protecting a white man challenged every assumption about the relationships between their peoples. Chief Running Bear rode at the front of the formation, his presence ensuring that every warrior maintained the dignity and discipline appropriate to their sacred mission. Occasionally, he would ride back to check on Thomas and his children, who were now strong enough to sit up and point out landmarks along the familiar trail. As the day progressed, Thomas began to understand that he was participating in something much larger than a simple escort. This was a ceremonial procession designed to demonstrate Cheyenne values to anyone who witnessed it. The message was clear: courage and compassion would be recognized and honored, regardless of race or background. Word of the extraordinary procession began to spread ahead of them. Hunters and scouts from various groups carried news of the site to settlements, military posts, and other tribal camps throughout the region. By evening, the story of the white man who saved 2 native children and earned a 100-warrior escort would be told around countless campfires. Thomas knew his life would never be the same after this day. The honor bestowed upon him by Chief Running Bear came with both privileges and responsibilities that would follow him wherever he went. He had become a bridge between 2 worlds at war with each other, a role he had never sought but now found himself uniquely qualified to fill. The unusual procession had been traveling for most of the day when they encountered their first group of white settlers. A small wagon train had stopped on a ridge overlooking the trail, and through his spyglass, the wagon master was watching the approaching dust cloud with growing alarm. What he saw defied all understanding: a lone white man being escorted by what appeared to be an entire Cheyenne war party. The wagon master, a grizzled veteran named Sam Hartley, immediately ordered his people to prepare for an attack. Women and children were moved to the center of the circled wagons while the men took up defensive positions with their rifles. They had heard stories of Native American raids, but none had ever seen anything quite like this organized formation. Approaching them, Chief Running Bear's scouts had spotted the wagon train long before the settlers noticed them. The chief rode forward to consult with Thomas about how to handle this potentially dangerous situation. Both men understood that a misunderstanding here could lead to bloodshed that would destroy everything they had accomplished. "Brother who saves children," the chief said quietly, "your people prepare for battle. They fear us, as we have feared them. Perhaps it is time for you to ride ahead and speak with them before arrows fly." Thomas nodded, understanding the wisdom in this approach. He guided his wagon out of the formation and rode slowly toward the circled wagons, calling out in English to identify himself. Behind him, the Cheyenne warriors maintained their position but made no threatening moves, their weapons held in ceremonial rather than combat positions. "Hello, the wagons," Thomas called out as he approached. "I'm Thomas Mitchell, a trader out of Denver. These warriors are my escort, not raiders. Hold your fire and I'll explain everything." Sam Hartley emerged from behind his defensive position, rifle still in hand, but pointed toward the ground. His weathered face showed deep suspicion as he studied Thomas and the impressive formation of warriors waiting behind him. In 30 years on the frontier, he had never seen anything remotely similar to this situation. "Mister, you'd better have a powerful good explanation for why you're riding with 100 hostiles," Hartley said bluntly. "My people are scared half to death, and trigger fingers get mighty itchy when folks are frightened." Thomas spent the next several minutes explaining what had happened at the river, how he had saved Chief Running Bear's children, and how the chief had responded by adopting him into the tribe and providing an honor guard. The story sounded so fantastic that Hartley might not have believed it, if not for the evidence of his own eyes. The proof of Thomas's story became clear when Little Hawk and Morning Star climbed down from the wagon and ran to show themselves to the nervous settlers. The children were obviously healthy and unharmed, their bright smiles and animated chatter providing clear evidence that they had not been mistreated or kidnapped. Chief Running Bear himself rode forward, accompanied by Grey Wolf and 2 other senior warriors. The chief's dignified bearing and peaceful gestures helped convince the settlers that this was indeed a diplomatic rather than military encounter. Through Grey Wolf's translation, Running Bear explained the sacred nature of the debt his tribe owed to Thomas. Word of the encounter spread quickly through the wagon train, and soon curious settlers were emerging from their defensive positions to witness this historic meeting. Many had never seen Native Americans up close, and they were surprised by the warriors' dignified behavior and evident intelligence. The children in particular seemed fascinated by Little Hawk and Morning Star, who had become minor celebrities. One of the settler women, a schoolteacher named Mary Collins, approached Morning Star with gentle gestures of friendship. Despite the language barrier, the two females found ways to communicate through smiles and simple gestures. This interaction between the settler woman and native child seemed to soften the atmosphere even further. As the tension gradually eased, Chief Running Bear made a decision that would become another part of the growing legend. He instructed several of his warriors to share gifts with the settlers, beautifully crafted items that demonstrated the artistic skills of their people. In return, some settlers offered coffee, sugar, and other trade goods as tokens of friendship. Thomas found himself serving as an informal interpreter and mediator, helping both groups understand each other's customs and intentions. His unique position as someone trusted by both sides gave him insights into how similar the two peoples actually were beneath their cultural differences. Both groups wanted safety for their families, prosperity for their communities, and respect for their traditions. After an hour of careful diplomacy, both groups parted on friendly terms. The settlers continued their journey with a new understanding of at least one tribe of Native Americans, while the warriors had seen that not all white people were automatically hostile or untrustworthy. Thomas's rescue of the two children was creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the original incident. As they resumed their journey, Chief Running Bear rode alongside Thomas's wagon for a final consultation. They were now approaching the boundaries of the territory where white soldiers regularly patrolled, and the chief knew his warriors could go no further without risking a military confrontation that could destroy the peace they had worked to build. "Brother who saves children," the chief said solemnly, "we must part ways here, but know that you carry the friendship of the Cheyenne people wherever you travel. If you ever have need of our help, send word through any of our people, and we will come to your aid." The chief then presented Thomas with a special gift, a beautifully crafted peace pipe decorated with eagle feathers and intricate beadwork. "This pipe has been blessed by our medicine man," Running Bear explained. "Show it to any Cheyenne warrior and they will know you are under our protection. It will also serve as proof of this day when others doubt your story." Thomas accepted the sacred gift with appropriate reverence, understanding its significance in Cheyenne culture. The pipe represented not just personal friendship, but a formal alliance between himself and the entire Cheyenne nation. Such gifts were rarely given to outsiders and carried tremendous responsibility along with their honor. The moment of parting had arrived, and both Little Hawk and Morning Star ran to Thomas for final embraces. Through their limited English and his few words of Cheyenne learned during their journey, they managed to express their gratitude and affection. The children had formed a special bond with the man who had risked everything to save their lives. Gray Wolf, the elderly warrior who had served as interpreter, also approached Thomas with a parting gift. He removed a small leather pouch from around his neck and placed it in Thomas's hands. "Medicine bundle," he explained in broken English. "Keep you safe on long trails. Remember, Gray Wolf, remember this day." One by one, the other warriors came forward to offer their own gestures of respect and farewell. Some made traditional signs of blessing, others offered small tokens or simply clasped Thomas's hand in the universal gesture of friendship. Each interaction reinforced the remarkable transformation that had occurred since their first tense encounter. Chief Running Bear raised his lance one final time, and the 100 warriors formed a ceremonial line facing Thomas's wagon. In perfect unison, they raised their weapons in salute, not as threats but as a military honor guard recognizing a fellow warrior. The sight was both magnificent and deeply moving, representing a bridge built across generations of mistrust and conflict. "Go in peace, brother who saves children," Chief Running Bear called out, as Thomas prepared to continue his journey alone. "May the Great Spirit watch over your path and bring you safely home. Know that you will always have a place among the Cheyenne people." Thomas raised his hat in response, too moved by emotion to trust his voice for a proper reply. He clicked his tongue to encourage his horses, and his wagon began rolling away from the assembled warriors. As he traveled down the dusty trail, He could hear the rhythmic chanting of the Cheyenne farewell song, a haunting melody that seemed to follow him across the plains. Behind him, the warriors maintained their formation until Thomas disappeared over a distant hill. Only then did Chief Running Bear signal for them to turn and begin their own journey home. The chief carried with him a new understanding of white men's potential for courage and compassion, knowledge that would influence his decisions in future encounters with settlers and soldiers. As Thomas continued alone toward the trading post at Bear Creek, he reflected on the incredible events of the past 2 days. He had begun this journey as a simple trader carrying supplies to frontier customers. Now he carried something far more valuable, proof that understanding and friendship were possible between peoples who had been taught to see each other only as enemies. The sacred pipe rested carefully wrapped beside him in the wagon, along with the other gifts from his Cheyenne brothers. These items would serve as tangible reminders of his adventure, but more importantly, they represented the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Thomas Mitchell was no longer just a trader. He had become a bridge between two worlds. The sun was setting as Thomas finally spotted the wooden buildings of Bear Creek Trading Post in the distance. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and he could see people moving about their evening chores. The familiar sight should have been comforting after his extraordinary adventure, but Thomas realized he was returning to a world that might not understand or appreciate what he had experienced. How could he explain to his fellow settlers that he had been adopted by a Cheyenne chief and escorted by 100 warriors? Who would believe that Native Americans could show such honor and gratitude? Many of his contemporaries viewed all tribal peoples as savage enemies, incapable of civilized behavior. As his wagon rolled into the trading post compound, Thomas was greeted by Jake Morrison, the post's owner and operator. Morrison was a practical man who had survived on the frontier by keeping his nose out of other people's business. But even he couldn't hide his curiosity about Thomas's delayed arrival and the stories already circulating about strange sightings on the plains. "Thomas," Morrison called out as he emerged from the main building. "Heard some mighty peculiar tales about a wagon being escorted by hostiles. Don't suppose you know anything about that?" His tone was casual, but his eyes showed genuine concern for his friend's well-being. Thomas climbed down from his wagon, suddenly feeling the full weight of exhaustion from his incredible journey. The physical and emotional strain of the past 2 days had taken their toll, and he needed time to process everything that had happened before he could properly tell his story. "Jake," Thomas said with a tired smile, "pour yourself a strong drink and sit down. I've got a tale to tell you that's going to challenge everything you think you know about our native neighbors." Jake Morrison poured 2 generous measures of whiskey and settled into his chair as Thomas began to recount his extraordinary adventure. The trading post owner listened in stunned silence as his friend described the rescue at the river, the night spent caring for the children, and the incredible encounter with Chief Running Bear and his 100 warriors. At first, Morrison was skeptical. Tales of peaceful interactions with native tribes were rare on the frontier, and stories of white men being adopted into tribal families were almost unheard of. But as Thomas produced the sacred pipe and other gifts from his Cheyenne brothers, the evidence became impossible to deny. "Thomas," Morrison said slowly, examining the beautifully crafted peace pipe, "do you realize what you've done? This isn't just about saving 2 children. You've created something that could change everything between our peoples." Over the following days, word of Thomas's adventure spread throughout the territory like wildfire. Traders, soldiers, settlers, and tribal members all heard variations of the story about the white man who risked his life to save Cheyenne children and earned the protection of Chief Running Bear. With each telling, the tale grew more elaborate, but the core message remained the same. Courage and compassion could bridge even the deepest cultural divides. Some settlers reacted with suspicion and hostility toward Thomas's new relationship with the Cheyenne. They questioned his loyalty and wondered if he might be passing information to potential enemies. A few military officers suggested he should be watched as a possible security risk, concerned that his friendship with Chief Running Bear might compromise settler defenses. But others saw Thomas's experience as an opportunity for better relations with the local tribes. Progressive leaders recognized that peaceful coexistence would benefit everyone, reducing the constant threat of conflict that made frontier life so dangerous. They began seeking Thomas's advice on native customs and diplomatic protocols. Thomas found himself thrust into an unexpected role as an informal ambassador between the white and native communities. His unique position as someone trusted by both sides made him valuable to anyone interested in negotiating treaties, trade agreements, or peaceful resolutions to territorial disputes. Chief Running Bear, meanwhile, faced his own challenges within the Cheyenne community. Some of his warriors questioned the wisdom of trusting any white man, regardless of his past actions. They argued that the white settlers' ultimate goal was to take all native lands, and that friendship with individuals wouldn't change that fundamental conflict. But the chief's decision proved wise as word of Thomas's story spread among other tribes as well. The tale of the white man who saved native children became a powerful symbol of possibility, inspiring other instances of cooperation and mutual aid between the communities. Several tribal leaders began to reconsider their absolute hostility toward all white settlers. 3 months after the rescue, Thomas received an unexpected visitor at his trading post. A young Cheyenne brave named Swift Eagle arrived carrying an urgent message from Chief Running Bear. The chief requested Thomas's help in negotiating with military authorities who were threatening to remove the tribe from traditional hunting grounds. Thomas agreed without hesitation, understanding that his debt to the Cheyenne people was as binding as theirs to him. His intervention in the negotiations helped prevent what could have become a violent confrontation, demonstrating the practical value of the friendship he had earned through his heroic actions. As months turned to years, Thomas continued to serve as a bridge between the two communities. He learned to speak Cheyenne fluently and adopted many native customs while maintaining his own cultural identity. His trading post became a neutral ground where representatives from both sides could meet safely to discuss their differences. Little Hawk and Morningstar grew into young adults, never forgetting the white man who had saved their lives. Little Hawk became a respected warrior like his father, but he also advocated for peaceful relations with white settlers whenever possible. Morningstar became a skilled diplomat in her own right, often serving as a translator during important negotiations. The sacred pipe given to Thomas by Chief Running Bear became a powerful symbol throughout the territory. When conflicts arose between settlers and native tribes, the appearance of the pipe often helped calm tensions and open communication channels. The artifact represented proof that friendship was possible between peoples who seemed destined for eternal conflict. Thomas eventually married and raised a family of his own, teaching his children the lessons he had learned about courage, compassion, and the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their appearance. His children grew up with a deep respect for Native American culture and often served as interpreters and mediators in their adult lives. The story of Thomas Mitchell and his rescue of Little Hawk and Morningstar became one of the most famous legends of the Colorado Territory. It was told around campfires, written about in newspapers, and eventually found its way into history books as an example of how individual acts of courage could transcend cultural boundaries. Chief Running Bear lived to be an old man, always maintaining his friendship with Thomas and his family. On his deathbed, the chief spoke of the white trader who had taught his people that honor and bravery existed in all races. He credited Thomas's actions with helping to prevent several wars and saving countless lives on both sides. Years later, when the frontier period had ended and the conflicts between settlers and native tribes had largely been resolved through treaties and integration, historians recognized Thomas Mitchell's rescue as a turning point in regional relations. His willingness to risk everything for 2 native children, and Chief Running Bear's generous response, had created a model for peaceful coexistence that influenced a generation of leaders. The trading post at Bear Creek eventually grew into a small town, with a monument commemorating the friendship between Thomas Mitchell and Chief Running Bear. The inscription reads, "In memory of 2 brave men who proved that courage and compassion know no boundaries of race or culture. Thomas lived to see his grandchildren playing with the grandchildren of Little Hawk and Morningstar, a sight that filled his aging heart with joy and satisfaction. He had saved 2 children from drowning in a river, but in doing so, He had also helped save two peoples from drowning in an ocean of mutual hatred and misunderstanding. The legacy of that stormy day by the river continued long after all the original participants had passed away. The story of Brother Who Saves Children became a teaching tale passed down through generations of both native and white families, reminding them that heroism comes in many forms, and that the greatest victories are often won through acts of simple, human kindness rather than force of arms. Even today, more than a century later, the legend of Thomas Mitchell serves as a reminder that individual courage and compassion can change the course of history. His story proves that when we reach across cultural divides to help our fellow human beings, we create bonds that can heal even the deepest wounds and build bridges that span the chasms between different worlds.